for the closing keynote, we have Candace Worley. Candace is the VP and Chief Technical Strategist at McAfee. And she's been working in B2B software her entire career. She's a leader in the security industry for 18 years now. And what she's going to share with us today is how we can find low-hanging fruits to start extending the automation in security in our companies. Please help me welcome to the stage Candace Worley. Thank you very much.
So much.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. So when they originally talked to me about this time slot at CEBIT, they told me that I was the closing keynote for the CEBIT event. And what I've just found out is I'm actually the warm-up act for the beer garden. So I want to thank you for sticking around to hear what I have to say today. As they mentioned a moment ago, I've been in the security industry for close to 18 years. It'll actually be 18 years next week, by the way. It's my 18-year anniversary in cyber. And over the course of that period of time, I've had an opportunity to talk to thousands of customers, partners, analysts about the cybersecurity challenges they face and kind of the ways in which they approach that. And oftentimes, as a part of that, they'll say they don't have enough resources in their organization to get all of the work done. And the topic of automation comes up. And I'm always kind of surprised at the level of skepticism that is exhibited by the security teams around employing automation at a broad scale. And when I ask, why do you not want to deploy automation at a broader scale? The answers usually come down to two particular things. And it's universal. Almost every company, thank you, says the same thing. The first is that they're afraid that they will automate a critical security function and then it will go terribly wrong. And when it goes terribly wrong, it will take down a DNS server, or it will kick the CEO offline, and his computer won't be able to connect to the network. And they'll be having a very uncomfortable follow-up conversation with the CEO and or the IT ops team, who now has to clean up the mess that that security automated script created. And if you're in the security team, you know how hard it can be to get the IT ops team to do anything for you anyway some days, right? So the last thing you want to do is have a situation where you implement an automated security script and it blows up, and now you're trying to get IT to make a change on their side, whether it's network or endpoint ops, and they're saying, like, why should I trust you this time given what happened the last time? Now, what I'm seeing the last couple of years is there's a number of factors that have been gaining speed in the market that I believe are really kind of bringing the automation quandary to the forefront again. And it's kind of eroding the skepticism that I've heard from security practitioners in the past. And they cross a number of different areas, but we're going to start with the actual threat itself, the nature of the threat and the attack surface. And if we look at that, if we just making sure the slide had changed, if we contemplate that, you know, the first time we see a certain kind of attack, we always wonder, like, what follows it. And what we're seeing now is that the nature of the attackers is dramatically different than it was 10, 15 years ago. You know, when I started 18 years ago, people were doing this for fun. Now we're talking about serious folks. We're talking about people who are highly educated, very well funded, have degrees sometimes that are better than the degrees our own employees have. They're nation states who are doing this specifically to steal secrets from other countries or to steal intellectual property from the industry and those companies in the service of their own economies. It's hacktivists. They want to make a point. Your company just happens to be the one that they've decided to make an example with. And then you have cyber criminals. With them, it's all about money. They're indifferent to who they target as long as they make a significant profit at the end of that process. And for me, the one that I struggle with the most is insider threats. It's the people that we're supposed to be able to trust. Our employees, our contractors, our partners. And they have a myriad of reasons that they decide to go rogue. But they can oftentimes be one of the most difficult ones to actually identify and track down. Now, to illustrate just kind of the the difficulty and the challenges around the volume of attacks, I thought I'd bring forward some stats from our labs department. They spend their daily lives buried in threats and signatures and malware samples. And our Global Threat Intelligence Cloud, as of June 2018, is clocking 48 billion queries per day. That is per day. As of January of this year, as a reference point, it was 44.1 queries per day. We've seen an uptick of 4 billion queries just in 5 months. And I really wonder what that bodes for by December of this year. The second point I thought was worth bringing up is in 2017, we saw a 32% increase in malware samples into our libraries. Those are submissions that are coming in from our customers and in through the products that we have deployed in the market. We have about 90 million endpoint sensors out there in the world on the corporate side. Now, that 32% growth ended up resulting in our library of malware samples popping up to about 600 million in total. And one of the things that I found fascinating about just kind of the samples we got in last year is of the new samples, 95% of those new samples submitted had file hashes that had been seen by less than 5 machines. What that tells us is that the malware writers are creating malware that's extremely unique and it's adaptable. So it can sense the environment that it's in and change on the fly in order to be able to survive the encounter with the security product. Now, the second area that we've got to think about is the amount of data that security and IT teams are having to deal with. As I was doing some research for this event, I was reading a research report from an organization called Domo. They did a research report last year on the amount of data that's being created in this digital world that we live in today. And one of the stats that I found kind of mind-blowing is that 90% of the data that resides in the world today has been created in the last 2 years. Think about that for a minute. Like if 90% of the data that resides in the world right now was created in 2 years, what is that data pool going to look like in 2 years from now, 4 years from now, 6 years from now? And how many of you are security practitioners? Okay, your job is to protect that, right? So that's going to get really, really hard, really, really fast. Now, the second statistic that I thought was pretty interesting comes from IDC's recent report on data and the data age for 2025. And it's that by 2025, 50% of all the data in the worldwide data sphere will go unprotected. Now, realistically, some of that data is likely consumer data. Some of it's data that's already in the public domain. But I would assert that there'll probably be a fair amount of it that organizations would prefer was not in the public domain and was protected at some level. The next stat that's pretty meaningful is as we move from this physical transaction world to a digital transaction world, IDC is also forecasting that we will be seeing 450 billion internet business transactions by 2020. Now, almost every one of those transactions is probably going to have some form of PII. How many of you have just lived through GDPR? A few? Maybe one or two? Could be an IP address, could be a name, could be an email address. If that's in one of those business transactions that's traveling across the internet, that now just became a security problem for your company. And finally, as we look at, oh, that jumped pretty far, the final stat, and I think this one has some really interesting implications for security, is that greater than 25% of all data created in 2025 will be in real time. Now, I would assert that if it's being created in real time, it's highly likely it's going to be communicated and shared in real time. We're already seeing that to a certain extent, but as a security practitioner, how do you ensure the security of corporate data that may be created and shared in real time? That's something we need to be contemplating as we move toward a world where content's created and shared on the fly. Now, our next challenge is really around regulatory hurdles. I mentioned GDPR. Every geography around the world has its own set of regulatory compliance requirements for companies. And although some verticals have more stringent requirements than others, say financial services, healthcare, maybe SCADA, there are still some that cut across the globe. We've just come through the go live date for GDPR. It's still pretty visible in the rearview mirror for us. And I know that every company I talk to that does business in Europe or is based in Europe is thinking about the processes they went through, the policies they put in place, the changes they made to their business process and their products to ensure that they're compliant with GDPR requirements. Because no company wants to be the test case for identifying what the margin of error or tolerance is around the GDPR regulation. Who wants to be the first one that gets tested out on that, right? That's not going to be a good day. And so as we look at this, the implications from a security perspective is that oftentimes, as we look at what we need to put in place from a security perspective to ensure the integrity and the security of corporate assets, it may very well be at odds with what we need to do to ensure the security and privacy of personal data. And we're going to have to find that balance between those two over the course of the next couple of years. Now, we also have an extremely difficult environment as it relates to just complexity. I started with McAfee back in 2000. It was a simpler time. In fact, at the time, I thought it was a very difficult time. Now, as I stand on this stage in 2018, I wish for the simpler time that was 2000 to 2005 from the security perspective. If we just think a little bit about what that environment looked like back then, you had desktops and servers. That was pretty much it for device types. You might have had a few mobile phones, but they were rare in the corporate context. You had Windows. You had Unix. There wasn't a lot of Linux yet. You might have had a Mac, but only the CEO and his executive team got Mac because they were expensive and they wanted them, so they get what they want, right? Applications were actually delivered by the security and IT team, or the IT team. They provisioned apps. You didn't just go to an app store. Oh, by the way, what was an app store in 2001, right? The network edge was solid. It wasn't porous. It was solid, and it offered dang good protection to the corporation in terms of being able to understand and control what data flowed in and out of the organization. Cloud was something that happened on a rainy day. Most of your data was in the context of a private data center on your premises within your control. That's what our world looked like back then. And then we had a tax on it, sure, but it was a whole lot easier to understand what was there and control it. Now just take a moment and contemplate what your world looks like right now. And don't think about home. I know you got the Nest thermostat and the Ring doorbell and the Alexa and whatever else it is that we've got in our homes. I do not have an Alexa, by the way. But think about work. Laptop, tablet, IP-connected printer at the office, likely at home. Mobile phone. Who doesn't have a smartphone at this point? Bluetooth mouse, Bluetooth keyboard. We're talking about almost everything we touch now is connected from a device perspective. We've added to that operating system entree list Android, multiple variants of Android, multiple variants of Linux. I'm sure there's some that I'm missing, but those are the big ones that have complicated things. Applications, the only time I get apps from IT at this point is when they give me a new laptop. And they've downloaded all the corporate apps on it. If I want apps otherwise, I go to the App Store on our internal corporate intranet, or I go to the iPhone, the iStore, or whatever it is, wherever I need them. And sometimes I can get an app that does the exact same thing for $4.99 on the App Store. Not that IT likes that, but it happens occasionally, right? And then as we talk about mobile devices are pervasive. And they've become pervasive for corporations as well as for personal use. In fact, this statistic comes from a company called Statistica that's been doing research on forecasting technology usage. And their expectation is that by 2020, we'll have 2.87 smartphones being used worldwide. Now, if we think about how does that happen, it's not just those of us who have, the infrastructure to support internet connections, but in many countries where that infrastructure's never been in place, they skipped the entire PC generation. They went straight to smartphones. They pay their bills, they buy, they communicate, they email, they do everything on a smartphone. So we're only going to see that increase. We've also added a multitude of additional variants of Android and other types of technology from a smartphone perspective. Next, let's talk about cloud. It would be remiss of me not to talk about cloud at this point. 5 years ago, my customers were saying, nope, I might use a SaaS application, but I am not moving to the cloud. They can't make me put my workloads in the cloud. Fast forward 3 years ago, it's like, well, I'll put a few things, but they're going to be non-critical. Now, we've got a Forbes article from January 2018 indicating that the people that they're talking to in the enterprise are saying that 83% of workloads, enterprise workloads, will move to the cloud by 2020. I actually think, based on the conversations I'm having with customers, that might be a bit aggressive, but it's probably not as far off as we once thought it would be. 3 years ago, we would have thought they belonged in a straitjacket. Now, I'm seeing a lot more customers move workloads to the cloud, and it could be hybrid or private or public. It's not all public, certainly. And then finally, you can't be at this event and not talk about IoT. Now, earlier, I think the guy from IBM referenced 20 billion, so it depends on who you talk to, what your number is. This, again, happens to be Statistica that this number came from. 31 billion IoT devices by 2020. And honestly, does it matter if it's 20 billion or 30 billion? Is our ability to secure 20 billion so much better than 30 billion? I think we got a serious challenge either way, to be honest. But I think it's something we need to be proactively thinking about right now. Building security in, making sure that as those devices enter the market, they're being thought about prior to delivery to the market itself. Now, the next thing we need to be thinking about is talent. So the bad news is you get to cover all those other factors we just talked about with probably less people and flat budgets. Now, that's not always the case. When it comes to security, I do talk to some companies who are increasing their security budget. Unfortunately, that generally happens right after the breach instead of it happening right before the breach, right? But back in April of 2017, we did a study with an organization out of Washington, D.C., a think tank called CSIS. And we did research on, is this labor shortage real, or is it just something that the market is hyping? We talked to about 800 IT security professionals across 8 countries. Europe, North America, and Asia were all represented. And the interesting data that we got was that of those respondents, 82% of them absolutely believe that there is a labor shortage in their geo and there is a labor shortage in their company. And in some cases, they went one step further and said their inability to find the right talent to fill their team has already resulted in a security incident in their organization. And they feel that if they can't fix that problem going forward, there will be more security incidents in their organization. Now, the second stat that I think is worth mentioning here, and I think one of the other folks also said 2 million. This data comes from IDC, or excuse me, not IDC, Cybersecurity Ventures, 3.5 million. But again, I would assert, so what if it's 1.5 million? Does that put us in a better spot than 3.5 million in terms of open security positions without the right talent to fill them? Whether it's 1.5, 2, or 3.5, it's a problem we've got to find an answer for. And it's not going to be people, because finding people means we have to fill the pipeline, and filling the pipeline of talent takes time. It's probably 4 to 6 years, depending upon the university, right? So automation, the topic of this discussion today, is one of the primary ways that we believe organizations are going to be able to solve this problem. And in fact, there was a bright, shining moment in that survey where respondents actually agreed with us. 9 in 10 of the IT professionals that responded to our survey indicated that they believe technology will be a primary bridge to solving the talent gap, that they will employ automation to ensure that the work gets done that they can't find humans to do for them. Now, we know that companies are doing everything in their power right now to try to solve for these challenges. In fact, we know that they're spending millions of dollars on security products. We know that they're doing their absolute best to hire the talent that's available. It's getting harder, but it doesn't mean they don't try. And we know that now that cybersecurity is in fact a boardroom issue, often discussed at the boardroom level, that they generally have the support of their executive management team in moving a cybersecurity program forward. And yet, they continue to get breached. And as I started to kind of dig into what are some of those drivers that are resulting in them getting breached, and what could they do within the control of their own organization to help mitigate those risks, I found 3 key things. The first, digital hygiene. Maybe a funny word, but it's no surprise to anyone that generally within hours of a vulnerability being announced, there's an attack in the marketplace. And yet what is shocking to me is that months later, you still have customers that have not deployed the patch. That's the digital equivalent to going on vacation and leaving the front door to your house open and being surprised when somebody backs a truck up to it, loads all your stuff, and drives away. Like you have a vulnerability. You chose not to patch it. You're gonna be at risk of a hack. And oh, by the way, what makes that worse is the fact that testing and deployment of updates is a highly automatable process. And if there was any doubt in anyone's mind about that, certainly I would assert that cloud and SaaS providers have put that to bed, because we know they're automating updates, right? The second area is companies buy security products to prevent breaches, and then they don't deploy them. Again, that's kind of like buying an alarm system for the house, not installing it or turning it on, and then being really irritated when you get robbed. It's like, well, you kind of bought the product, but you didn't put it in place to prevent the thing you were trying to prevent when you bought it. That's crazy, all right? Now, part of that is often because companies don't feel they have the capacity or the experience with given technologies in order to be able to get it installed. But honestly, if that's the case, you have systems integrators, partners, resellers, security vendors, MSPs that have the right talent in their organization to assist you with that. A board of director level conversation after a breach where you as a decision maker has to explain why you bought the product and didn't deploy it and ended up getting breached is not a good day. In fact, I call that a made available to industry conversation for the person who made the decision not to get that stuff deployed. Big challenge. And then the third key thing that organizations can do is right now they're buying technologies, security technologies, that are incapable of sharing threat information or communicating with each other in real time. And as we talk to the incident response folks in our pro services group, they tell us that the gaps between security technologies are extremely efficient and often employed mechanisms through which hackers penetrate a corporate infrastructure. When you have a product that actually blocks something at one point in the network and could teach every other countermeasure on the network about that attack, but doesn't have the ability to communicate it to them, your entire security system has to learn all over again at every point of entry into the network. By acquiring technologies that have the ability to communicate, that are part of an open ecosystem, you can actually accelerate the time that it takes for you to educate every countermeasure in your environment against a given attack. Now, part of what we know is going to have to happen is we're going to have machines and humans start to work more closely together. Because, I also share some of the skepticism of those security folks as it relates to broadly automating, especially critical security functions. Things can go wrong. We've all probably experienced them going wrong, either as a user or a practitioner. And so bringing together the power of machines and the strategic intellect, and contextual capabilities of humans is the best of both worlds. we believe that we're going to see continued efforts around this particular area, especially as AI and machine learning and deep learning continue to evolve. Now, if we think about the special talents of machines, they're incredibly good at sifting through oceans of data, looking at that data, analyzing that data, and outputting information and assumptions based on that data. They can get through terabytes of data much more quickly than even a large team of humans can. And the reason that that's important is that by the time they get through the data, it's still fresh, it's still timely. And had it been humans that took days or months to get through all of that, they would have been doing it from a retrospective angle, would have been looking back as opposed to looking at now. Now, what humans bring to the equation is two things. The first is they're able to take the information that's provided by machines and apply strategic intellect. They're able to take into consideration contextual information around the analytics that may give them subtle clues into identifying a very nefarious attack that might be difficult to identify through some other means. They also bring to the table the ability to do, we'll call it checking on the automation. Because if you're in a situation where you've automated process that could have a material impact on, say, something like your DNS server, as I mentioned earlier, or your CEO's laptop, it might be good to have a person check the decisions around that automation before the big red button gets hit. You're going to want to make sure that the risk is really there, that the response that's being proposed is appropriate to the risk level for that particular event before you execute that. And humans can bring that to the table. Now, as we look forward, we know that companies are automating. In fact, we did a survey in 2017 of security operations centers in anticipation of a product release, and we found that in very mature SOCs, they've already automated about 75% of their most manual tasks. On the flip side, however, in immature SOCs, it's only about 30% of the manual tasks. And the reality is there are more immature SOCs than there are mature SOCs, because you need a certain level of talent, certain number of people, certain amount of budget to put the right tools in place to get that level of SOC maturity required to be able to automate at that level. Now, beyond the SOC, there's other security processes that have been automated for a long time. McAfee themselves, as well as many of our competitors, have products that will automatically send a file to a global threat intelligence cloud to determine conviction or exoneration. Is it good? Is it bad? You also have automated processes around updating DAT files, updating application or operating system files. Those have been automated for a very long time. Most organizations automatically feed events and logs and alerts into their SIEM. Now, the challenge with that SIEM is that there are terabytes of data in the SIEM, maybe zettabytes, depending on the size of your company. How does your team get through all of that information? You need automation as part of that process to streamline the information gathering process ahead of case investigation downstream. Now, we also have to take into consideration IoT. Right now, yes, we all have IoT systems in our environment. But with the number of those devices that are coming online, the number and amount of data that's going to be generated in the form of logs and alerts and events is going to grow exponentially. Think about a bridge sensor, which is now sending data to a back-end infrastructure. Think about a pacemaker that's uploading data directly into a server at a hospital so that a doctor can determine the health state of a remote patient. That's going to add to this data and the controls and the inspection that have to be put in place by security operations centers in determining whether or not there's malicious activity associated with a given event. So, although organizations and many of their functions have automated, there is still a lot of organizations that have not automated. And so there's work and room to grow in terms of adding automation to the mix. Now, our belief at McAfee is that what we need is security solutions that are based on a platform, that right on top of a platform that's delivering integration from device to cloud to partner. And it's delivering 3 key capabilities. The first is the ability to have cross-countermeasure, vendor-agnostic communication and threat sharing. The second is the ability to automate the most manual of tasks so that you're saving the talent you have in your organization for the most critical security functions. And the third is delivering a policy management and analysis framework that streamlines the work of the operations and the SOC team and acts as a watchdog on automated decisions that may be coming out of the scripts that you've put in place. And we fundamentally believe that by doing this, by leveraging automation and the capabilities of machines for carving through data very rapidly, in concert with the contextual and strategic intellectual capabilities of people, that will be able to dramatically reduce the time to detection and correction. We'll be able to accelerate our efforts to thwart criminals. We'll be able to allow humans to focus on the trickiest of investigations. And finally, we'll be able to minimize the risk to the overall organization. And if we as an industry can deliver on this, on the power of machines and humans working together, then we believe that we'll be able to secure those assets that are most important to consumers and corporations alike. Thank you very much for your time.